Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
Okay, yeah. So here we go. Welcome everybody to Lunch with Tech Leaders. We're going to have a conversation on site reliability engineering and a bunch of acronyms. So we're going to learn a lot today. We're going to get some great insights from our panel of industry experts and leaders here. No pressure, guys. We are at the top of the food chain with who we've brought to the table here today. So I'm going to do a little quick round of introductions. First up, a staple of our talks is Tom Kowalski. Say hi, Tom.
Howdy. Hello. Tom Kowalski. Been in the industry for over 15 years now. Mostly focused on consulting, contracting around data systems integrations. So.
And you are an AWS community builder, correct?
That's correct.
How did you get that distinguished title?
They reached out to me. Like the step. Have you ever heard of if you haven't heard of it, there's like the AWS Heroes, which is like the step higher, right? And
yeah,
like the next tier. So,
nice.
Yeah.
I saw that on your LinkedIn. I was like, that's impressive. All right, over to Jordan. Jordan DeBeer, welcome.
Hey there, yeah, I'm Jordan DeBeer, customer engineer at Google, mostly focused on application modernization, which really is means kind of like everything DevOpsy, containers, serverless, with a little bit of SRE stuff built into that. I live here in Michigan. I work out of the Detroit office, but I'm located in the small town of Brooklyn, Michigan, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, mostly focused on helping grow GCP customers and setting some cool standards and strategy around all stuff application modernization at Google.
Nice. And how long have you been with Google?
I think it'll be 2 years now. And then prior to that, I was actually at AWS for a little bit. So
wow.
I definitely have some AWS experience as well.
Cool. And last but not least, we've got Kyle Robertson.
Hello.
Hey, Kyle.
Hey, I'm Kyle. I am currently an SRE at Github. I've been there for like 7 or 8 months. I work from the small, humble town of Berkeley, Michigan. So that's me.
Yeah.
Great to have you, Kyle. So let's just dive in. Where should we start? Let's. I always like to start with a little bit of history.
Yeah.
Of the SRE field. Like, how did it become a thing, and like, why is it a thing? So Kyle, Jordan, take us away.
Once upon a time in the past, pre-internet, right? You shift software on a CD or something like that, and that was it, right? Like generally, you're hoping it was pretty good. If something was wrong, you could make a patch and ship out another CD, but really, like that was the end. But then the internet came along, and people started being able to use software via the internet, right? You go to, GeoCities and see cool GIFs. And, that was like a novelty, right? Like people were we still didn't have like smartphones and stuff. So people generally had one computer still, they would go use it at certain times during the day, and that was it. But as the 2000s rolled along and we started getting smartphones and more things started becoming doable on the internet, people started to rely more and more on these things to do their things in their daily life. And at that point, there became an expectation of, hey, this thing needs to be up and available, because if it's not, I can't do the things I need to do in my daily life. So we really needed a way to focus on availability and be able to describe how, if something's available and like to what degree, and also give customers a promise of like, this is how available our system's going to be. And that's really where we're at right now. And that's kind of how the discipline of site reliability engineering started.
Good stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that
Jordan.
definitely makes sense. Like, as we saw more and more people relying on the internet and like software as a service and things like that, and it kind of changed how like we thought about engineering and like operations and uptime as well. It used to be like a service went down and like you would just like either page a ticket or like cut a ticket to like a sysadmin or something like that, and they would awaken from their deep dark basement and like go fix it whenever they had the time to stop putting out fires. And then we kind of changed to a model exactly like what you're talking about, where we had like these responsive 24/7 like network operation centers, and they're really just kind of not sitting around waiting for things to happen, but just being prepared for when the inevitable like systems failure does happen. And I think part of the reason that SRE comes into that is the responsive model didn't really scale too well, right? We stuck a bunch of people in like a room and just told them to sit around and wait for things to go wrong. And they kind of had to, as things went wrong, react still to those sorts of things. So SRE at least gives them a way to know when to react and how can you prioritize like when should we be delivering features versus focus on reliability, things like that. So I think SRE really comes in after we go from like a reactive to a responsive model to now more like an automated system and things like that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Google the birthplace of SRE, the SRE discipline?
Yeah. Google, invented the term like SRE, and it was really our take on like, hey, how can we take software engineering best practices, something Google is really good at, and apply them to operations. So it's really kind of taking a lot of engineering, specifically software engineering things, and applying them to the operation side. And from that, kind of the term SRE was founded. The movement did start kind of like partially with inside Google and partially out, just via like DevOps. And SRE is really just kind of Google's flavor or take on it. DevOps is a philosophy, SRE is a role. That's kind of how we see it internally and how we broadcast it to our customers and just people doing internet things. So
yeah. And then so a question for both of you. I'll start with Kyle though. Like when you at your respective organizations, is there DevOps engineers, quote unquote, or at GitHub, is it like you're an SRE or you're a software engineer? Do they even have like these quote unquote DevOps type roles? Because I agree with you, Jordan. DevOps is a philosophy, it's a practice. I've never been a fan of having a DevOps engineer, but here we are, right? So Kyle, how do they set it up at GitHub?
Sure. Yeah. So there are SREs, obviously, but I would say that DevOps is a practice and it's a shared responsibility model, right? Like service teams are enabled to deploy their own codes, make changes to their pipeline, etc. Like, and it's ultimately their responsibility as well. But we do provide assistance, and there's other groups that are experts in different pieces of that chain that can help provide assistance.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good kind of background on what SRE is, how it came to be. So let's dive into something a little more that we want to talk about today, which is these acronyms. We'll start with SLIs. What's an SLI? Why do I need it? Why do I care about it?
So I think to talk about that, we first need to talk about we need to be able to measure availability and provide some kind of quantitative, like, this is how available. Because if I just say, yeah, our service is available, like, what does that mean? And it's going to mean different things to different people. So we need to be able to provide a number or some kind of thing that is like quantifiable and the same for everybody, to show that. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is we need to figure out some kind of way to say, this is how our service is performing. And at the very root of it is SLIs, which stands for service level indicators. And these are very base metrics that you can use to measure your system. So for example, it could be like request latency. It could be error rate potentially of requests. There's plenty of other things too. Those are just the two examples I can think of. Ultimately, it's going to be metrics that are meaningful to your system that you're measuring and that can represent how available it is.
Okay. Jordan, anything to chime in on that?
Yeah. A lot of people, when they think SLIs, they kind of what comes into their head, maybe they're like their Prometheus metric labels. And that's definitely like a good kind of like starting place for like what sort of these things are. The way I like to think of it is, we had just talked about kind of like availability history, and like the big one is kind of just like Nagios, right? It would like this black box running somewhere, it would reach out and like try to connect to a thing. And if it connected that thing, it was up. The way that I thought about it is before, we had this function called like is service up. And it returned a true or a false. But once we started moving to more and more like distributed systems, true and false doesn't tell you the whole story there, right? If it takes like a minute to connect and do your thing, no user is going to meaningfully perceive that as up. So, we started looking at like, is service up? Well, like we can connect within, 100 milliseconds. And that's our definition of kind of like up there. And from that, we can actually do way more cool like math and actually just tell like what is the health of our service from 0 to 100 as opposed to true or false, 0 or 1, on or off. So yeah, SLIs are kind of the way that we move it from like a Boolean value to more of a how do we want to measure this thing? Could be latency, number, some sort of like division, number of healthy good requests versus bad requests, and things like that.
Is there like a set of like these are the must-have SLIs for any web-based application?
Yeah. Or is there like a standard, like in the industry, like this is like a named standard that's common SLIs?
I mean, generally, you're probably going to look at like latency and like the threshold of good over total as a very base. It could, and really, I think from there, it's obviously it could differ depending on like what your system cares about. But those generally end up being the two primary ones that you're measuring.
So if there's a set standard right in the industry, who kind of decides what they are? Like within, I know you're both in larger organizations, and I tend to think like the smaller ones. So, implementing them personally, it was it's kind of gray area on like who's doing it. So yeah, how does it work in the larger organizations?
Yeah, there's something called like the 4 golden signals, which isn't fully encompassing of all kind of like metrics that you should measure, but it's the 4 kind of like standard or like big ones that you should really be looking at there. They're all kind of described in the SRE book from Google, which is kind of like our when we like invented SRE, it was really the publication of the SRE book. When we kind of like externalized that thing outside of Google, I feel like that it was like more invented than when we made it internally. But those 4 golden signals are like latency, traffic, errors, and saturation.
Saturation.
Yeah, that's like the last one always gets me there. And that's really what you should at least start looking at when you're looking at like defining your SLIs. You might have something that's outside of that. You might have some more kind of like complicated metrics, something that maybe brings in a couple different like SLIs and adds them together or something like that. But those are your 4 kind of like base level indicators that are almost always going to be something that's important in measuring the health of essentially any web application or any sort of like application and things like that.
I'm kind of familiar with New Relic, and they kind of combined those SLIs together, right, to form their I forget what they call it. It's like a little rating, right? Their little health rating. I guess are there industry standards that kind of make like this is one number, right? Your health, or is it kind of just pick and choose?
You know, the AppDex with
AppDex,
New Relic.
that was it. Yeah.
Where and it was like there was an AppDex for like the latency, and then there was like AppDex for other things as well. So
it was like there was like a main one that they kind of like bundled in like errors versus requests. And there's like a formula that they have like a little, yeah.
I wonder if they're trying to reduce like cardinality or something potentially.
So
symbol cache.
Okay, so I built my app. I had talked to my friend Kyle. He said, "Hey, you got to monitor this thing." So I slapped some Nagios on there, macaroni, whatever you call it. And I'm tracking some metrics. So then what do I do? So I've got at least I have these SLIs, and then where do we go from there?
So the next step really is you're going to want to define. You have all these metrics, right? you're going to want to define, okay, well, what's an acceptable threshold for them, right? Like if we're collecting like some metrics that show us like the ratio of good over total requests, like their next step would be like, okay, well, what's an acceptable percentage or acceptable rate of like of percentage good for my service to be considered available? Or what is like an acceptable latency threshold, something like that. So your next step is going to be looking at those, and that target, it's represented usually as a percentage, and that is what we call a service level objective or an SLO. And when you're looking at this, it can be tricky because like if it's a brand new service, you don't really have a lot of data to look at. You kind of have to make an educated guess based on like what kind of system you're making. Is there any kind of similar parallels? If you're looking at like an older system, let's say you have like a legacy system that you want to move to this model with, you can look at historical data and get like a kind of a gauge of like, okay, this is what we see. We can kind of say, hey, like we can go for this target. And generally you want to start like, you want to give yourself some like, maybe I'm going too much into the weeds, but generally you want to like start kind of a little bit lower to give yourself some breathing room, because you always want to reevaluate these right over time, because your customers' expectations change, your system changes, and that's going to change how reliable your system is. That was a lot, sorry. So
no, it's good. Jordan, I'll give you a chance to chime in.
Yeah, no, I think you covered like a lot of the points really well. The thing about like when you're picking that number though is it shouldn't go on like what do you think you can obtain, what do you think like you're currently doing. You shouldn't use kind of just like those sorts of things to help decide what your SLO is going to be. It really needs to be driven by your users, what they're actually trying to do. That could be internal, like users. A large organization, you might have like internal teams that have internal customers as well, or they might be end users. That's kind of the big kind of like draw of SRE, is providing like a good, reliable experience. The other thing is that your SLO should not be 100%. I think if you kind of had to take like one little piece of SRE, just kind of tautology that you have to believe, because it is true, is that systems are not 100% reliable, and they never will be. If you don't believe that, then like you should probably not do SRE at all. It basically says that failures are inevitability. Things are going to go down, and SRE really kind of helps track like how you can manage those sorts of things and failures. It doesn't go into any detail on how to fix those failures, just what sort of things you should be looking at in order to kind of communicate those things. So yeah, if your SLO is 100%, you're probably not going to make it, and it's not a real good metric to aim for. It's not healthy. You'll never be able to eliminate the operational toil that it's required to get to that 100% availability over a given period of time.
Again, so, who owns the SLOs, right? Who sets them? Who's tracking them? Who cares, right? Is it like a shared thing? Is it like product owns it, or is it? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it would be like when we talk product, we might mean like an application or like a group of microservices and things like that. At the end of the day, I think they would be the real owner there, but that's really driven by customer expectations. At the end of the day, if they only need 50% availability or something like that, you could set it to 55% or something like that, aim a little high or something. But at the end of the day, I think the product team or whoever owns the application is the one that has to say, yeah, we can do this SLO. This is what we meaningfully think that we can get and what we're aiming for, and the path that we're choosing to go forward on.
I agree 100%. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go for it.
I was going to say I agree 100% with like the customer centric, because like you can pick a number, but like if you're like, let's say you pick 99% for like availability. If your customer is like, actually I expect 99.9, like your number is kind of meaningless at that point. Like you definitely want to drive availability based on what your customers expect, and like getting that continuous feedback is going to help influence that. So I 100% agree with you on that.
I think one really good story around that is the fact that your SLO, you should not meaningfully exceed it. So if you want to be up 99% of the time, at the end of the year, you should probably be up around 99% of the time. Customers expect like availability or what we kind of define as availability with like request latencies and things like that. So if you're meaningfully exceeding that, you've altered the customer expectations regardless of anything that you've said. There's a really funny story within Google where we had a distributed service called Chubby. It was a distributed locking service, and it was getting, I think its SLO was not 5 nines of availability, so like very little downtime, and they were exceeding that, which is, in most organizations, like a really cool thing. But Google actually decided to start like dropping requests in order to get closer to that 5 nines of availability. And it's super important because it stops your users from expecting, really like good days. Like bad days are going to happen, so you need to be able to, in any distributed system, account for that sort of thing. So while your users are the ones that are kind of like setting it, they're probably always going to say 100%. And we already kind of mentioned you can't get there, and you don't want to exceed what you say that you can get, because it can cause some issues in setting their expectations incorrectly, I think.
So in talking about the users and setting that, I feel like that kind of segues into the SLA. Right now, how do those play, the SLA and the SLO? And what is the SLA?
If I could have one last question on the SL, should we have tiered SLOs? Like my system is in a warning state, right? Like, latency is down but not terrible. Like, I always struggled with that. I've done this, type of monitoring, and it's always like, well, there's kind of like a threshold of like, if it's below this, there's something we should look into, versus like, the poop hit the fan, scenario, right? So do you guys like tier the SLOs, or is that kind of overcomplicating it?
So there's the concept of looking at like the burn rate of your SLO. So that's like kind of the rate in which because you have a budget of time, right? Let's say you say your availability is like 99.9, gives you like amount of time per evaluation period that you can be down. So you can represent like that as a burn rate. So how much are you burning into your budget for a given time? And that's a way you can kind of like preemptively figure out like, okay, well, we're kind of approaching a bad point here. We should probably do something before you completely fail your SLO.
Yeah, that's 100% what I was going to mention as well. Looking at like the burn rate of your SLO is super, super important. You can actually use that burn rate to calculate, when you should spend time prioritizing features versus reliability, which in itself is a feature, right? Most systems, at a given scale, you can get significantly higher availability by turning off like your pipelines and your version control and things like that. If you don't make any changes to your application, it's going to be really stable. Just don't change anything, and you can figure out really well how to keep that one thing alive for as long as possible. Kind of doesn't really work. Features need to get added and things like that. So your SLOs, in addition to the burn rate, once you start getting close to that sort of thing, it lets you say, hey, like we've used up all of our error budget. We're only halfway through the month. We're going to spend the rest of our time prioritizing reliability engineering, making our software engineering to make the application or the service more reliable, as opposed to adding new features and things like that. Because you're either at risk of exceeding your SLO, or pretty close to it, and you don't have a very good margin for how much risk that you want to take and allow your software engineers to have to do crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concepts with that, like on the burn rate piece, because I'm coming from my experience in a small business where it's like, the service is like slower than normal, right? Let's say the latency is 2x what it normally is, but the thing still works. So are we really going to drop everything we do to like stop working on features to address this quote unquote SLO that's not being met? So I think it's real easy for businesses to say, yeah, we're not going to prioritize that. Just adjust the SLO, or like, yeah, we know it's slow, or increase the server size, and like we'll revisit it in 6 months. So I'm just kind of like thinking of all these things that used to drive me nuts working at other companies, and it's like, I don't know if you're at a top tier shop like a GitHub or Google, it sounds like you guys prioritize these these types of initiatives where it's like, if we're not hitting our error budget, yeah, it's time to go.
Yeah,
Or if we
absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And to kind of just like plus one on that, that's kind of the, I don't want to say the problem with the SRE book, but something that it lacks, right? Is like, how do you actually alert on your SLOs or like your SLIs and things like that? Like SRE does a really good, or the SRE book does a really good job of talking about like SLOs, SLIs, like toil and like on-call rotations. And really that's what it's around, is eliminating the toil of operations work. If you're familiar with the SRE book, there's actually kind of like a sister/companion book that was, I think, written sometime after. I don't know when it came out, a couple of years ago, called the SRE Workbook. Would highly recommend giving that a read because it goes into exactly the sort of things that you're talking about there. There's literally a section that's like alerting on SLOs, and it has, like what PromQL Prometheus queries should you actually use in order to like calculate your burn rate, or like when should you start alerting based on your SLIs and things like that. So would highly, if you're looking on like the implementation side, highly recommend the SRE workbook as opposed to just the SRE.
Yeah. And
I'd second that.
And it's like, oh, the alerts go to the Slack channel that's supposed to be monitored by the team, but then half the developers on the team have muted the channel. It's like all these things, like when you're dealing with like the that impact how teams operate. So, all right, sorry for that fork in the road there, Tom. I know you wanted to move on to SLAs, which is, I think, is like the highest.
He walked away.
Yeah, I saw him. Yeah,
he was like, I'm done.
SLAs.
So let's move over to SLAs. How do SLAs tie into the SLOs and SLIs that we've kind of defined and discussed?
So an SLA stands for service level agreement. So generally, this is like a publicly published agreement of. It's really an SLO, but it's like a publicly published one, right? It's like saying, we as this company will guarantee that our service will be available this amount, this percentage based on this time frame. And generally it also includes like, if we're not, here's what their consequence. And usually that ends up being some kind of monetary consequence. Like if you look at like AWS, I'm assuming Google Cloud probably has the same thing. They'll say like, if depending on how much time we failed, you'll get this amount of credit. You generally make your agreement lower than your internal standards to give you that sort of flexibility to experiment and like fail. But ultimately, like this is like your kind of your contract with your customers.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that Tom walked away there because it kind of brings up like a good point that like SLOs, while we care about them in SRE, they're kind of like outside of the scope of the SRE. They're really like more of like a business decision, maybe even like a legal one. So it's kind of interesting that he had to get up and like walk out of the room because that's kind of like symbolic of SLAs within like SRE organizations. So that it's a business thing. It's not like a technical or an engineering thing. It's just one entity saying to another, like, hey, yeah, if we're not meeting this level of service, like we're at fault. We've done something wrong. So they are kind of tied to SLOs and that they should probably always be a little bit lower. But they're kind of in the realm of the business things and business agreements and things like that. So while we do care about them and they are important, they're outside of the realm of like the technical parts of SRE and more
right. So I mean, if I'm in marketing or if I'm in leadership and I'm a non-technical person and my SREs come to me and say, well, what's an acceptable SLA for the service? I might say, well, I mean, 100%. Our customers need this thing up 100%. Like, what you're asking me how much failure we're going to tolerate? So I mean, I've dealt with it. How do you guys deal with that type of expectation that's not realistic when you're dealing with the non-technical stakeholders or even technical stakeholders, just people who say it needs to be up 100% of the time? How do you kind of navigate that diplomacy of like, well, it can't be 100%, but it needs to be something?
So I guess the way I try to think about it is like, okay, well, we have what we can control, right? Like we can control the software that we push. We can control the settings in like Kubernetes if we're running on Kubernetes, whatever. But there's going to be things outside of that we cannot control. Like literally, you can even think about like electricity coming into the data center, right? Like there could be catastrophic failure there. And ultimately, we have no control over that. So because there's so many sub-dependencies, like there's no way you could ever hit 100%. And even if you decided you wanted to, that means you could never, ever, ever have any kind of failure. So every code push is a huge risk. Every configuration change is a huge risk. And you're really just going to burn your engineers out because they're just going to be constantly worried of like, well, if anything goes wrong, I've ruined our SLA and our company's going to like die because we have to pay a bunch of money to people.
Yeah, I mean, just to put it in perspective, like, 4 nines, 99.99% availability. That gives you a budget of like an hour, a year, right? Of like downtime. And that's like almost nothing. So I think it's like very, when you think about that number of what you want it to be to the public, you have to give it a reasonable budget, or else you're going to find yourself in a lot of difficult marketing and public relations challenges, and even billing when people are saying, you missed SLA, so give me my money back. Yeah, what are your thoughts on SLAs, Jordan?
Yeah, so Ben Traynor is the guy that kind of like invented, or he's like the father of SRE within Google. Please don't tell him I'm saying this, but I have a theory that SRE, kind of like Google made it public in order to kind of like help set the expectation that like they're not going to be 100% available. It's probably not true, but I'm going to believe it is, and no one can change my mind except for maybe him directly. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just education in like the industry and the community, and like you said, like technical folks tend to understand it a little bit better. So I think it's most of it is education, going to like the business and being like, hey, we can't meaningfully get to this number. That's a really big part of it. And the other thing is just understanding that reliable systems can be built upon unreliable ones. So the best example of this that most people are probably familiar with is like RAID, right? So we have disks. In the olden days, they used to be spinning pieces of rust, physically moving things. These fail all the time. So what we decided to do was just take a redundant array and stick it all in one box. And then all of a sudden, we can tolerate when one of these unreliable disks failed in order to create a more reliable system. So introducing redundancy into your sort of to anything that you can is going to kind of help mitigate the fact that you can't meaningfully achieve 100% availability on any given thing. So yeah, education around the fact that 100% is not attainable, and just the fact that reliable systems can be built upon unreliable ones is a big piece there.
Tom, you stepped away, and we kind of went into the SLA topic. So was there anything, and you had something on your mind, I want to make sure you get a chance to bring it up and see if we can discuss it.
Just the balance between them. Not sure if you talked about it, right? But like, who's setting the one versus the other, and who's maintaining that. So
yeah, I think we did touch on it, so we won't rehash it. But it was kind of like it's a combination, and Tom's stepping away again.
Tom walks away again.
I
don't think he actually cares.
All right, so like this is really I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we can wrap it up here. Anyone's welcome to share some final thoughts, but I think this really kind of opens up Pandora's box of what other things we could talk about related to SRE, because it gets into like postmortems and how the SREs actually help delivery teams achieve these SLOs, right? Because you guys aren't just like the gatekeepers, sitting on a wall and sitting in your tower and judging. Like, you guys are in there trying to help them to build these things. So I think we could really take this series in so many directions. Really appreciate the insights that everyone brought to the table today, and I'll leave it at that. If anyone else has anything else they want to add, go for it. Nothing. Okay, well, this concludes another great discussion with the Great Lakes Tech Leaders. We're having a lot of fun here. Please join us at leaders.rbn.ai. Hop on the Discord and become part of the community. And look forward to having another SRE talk maybe in January. Kyle, Jordan, does that work for you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Like, subscribe, ring the bell, donate to my Patreon. Whatever else they say.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Bye.
yeah,
Thanks everyone.